Okay, get started. Good evening. My name is Colin Classic. I'm an early career science fellow at Center for Ocean Solutions, and I'd like to invite you to tonight's presentation or our discussion, current perspectives and challenges in human rights and fisheries. There are little change to what I said earlier. If you are still working on your delicious food, then please don't rush. There's a table over here that will just collect the bowls, and we'll worry about that at the end of tonight's discussion. So tonight's event is sponsored by the Monterey Area Research Institutions Network for Education. Sorry, it's a long name. Acronym, very smartly, Marine. And Marine is managed by the Center for Ocean Solutions in partnership with 7 Monterey Bay area campuses. That's CSU Monterey Bay, Middlebury Institute Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, Moss Landing Marine Labs, Naval Postgraduate School, Stanford Hopkins Marine Station, Stanford University, and UC Santa Cruz. Sorry, I have my cheat sheet here. So Marine is a great organization that provides graduate students and early career professionals with skills and opportunities to be able to increase and better prepare them for as future ocean and coastal leaders. And if this is one of your first Marine events, please, I encourage you to talk to any of the Marine liaisons. They have blue t-shirts like Amanda's. Or you can also go to our website at centerforoceansolutions.org/marine, where you can get other information about events and our various resources that we provide. So I told you about housekeeping. Moss Landing Marine Labs has provided this room for us, so help us keep it clean. And any of the food or there's recycling here and waste behind that. So please just move bowls and any of your recyclables or waste to those bins. And thank you for joining us for tonight's event. Now I'd like to turn it over to Kristen Green and Sarah Hellman. They're going to provide us an overview of tonight's topic and introduce us to tonight's panel.
Thanks, Colin. So as Colin said, we're the Marine Liaisons. My name is Kristen Green. I'm a PhD student at Stanford, and I'm actually a Moss Landing grad, so it's nice to be back here tonight in this beautiful seminar room with whales outside. It makes me realize how I think I appreciated it when I was here, but I'm not. It's always good to remind yourself of how lucky you are to be here. And Sarah is currently a Moss Landing student, and she's one of the Marine liaisons as well. And we wanted to hold a winter seminar that involves talking about human rights and fisheries, because this is an under-recognized topic, especially in some of the academic communities, and we wanted to bring increasing awareness to it. And we're lucky to have a few panelists and a moderator to talk to you all tonight. And we wanted to start off with opening with a few minutes of a video on pirates and slaves to sort of set the stage here. And before we play this, just the general overview of the night is that we'll have the talks will go from, I guess it's around 6 o'clock right now, from 6 to 6:30, and then we'll have a moderated session where the audience will have a chance to ask some of our experts questions for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then there'll be sort of additional reception time until 8 o'clock for people to continue to mingle and have happy hour. So thank you again for coming. We're really happy to have you all here, and I hope you enjoy the panel tonight. Is that too loud?
In the last half-century, Thailand's fishing grounds have been decimated by industrial fishing. Over Overexploitation has depleted fish stocks and devastated marine biodiversity in both the Andaman Sea and Gulf of Thailand, leaving swathes of ocean devoid of large fish. The huge fleet of unmonitored fishing vessels responsible for this destruction often uses trafficked slave labor, forcing vulnerable migrants to work for nothing to satisfy our appetite for cheap seafood. It's a cycle of human misery and environmental devastation. A Thai fishing vessel now catches just 14% of what it would have caught 50 years ago. Faced with declining catches, vessel operators have targeted so-called trash fish, which is used to make animal feed. Around a third of this is made up of juvenile fish from commercially important species. The cycle of overexploitation has accelerated the depletion of Thailand's marine resources, and little is being done to save what remains. Overfishing in Thailand's waters, especially by trawlers operating too close to shore, causes major damage to fragile marine environments. These areas act as nurseries and breeding grounds for many species of fish and provide habitats for a number of endangered marine animals. Behind this environmental catastrophe lies human tragedy. Exploitation, trafficking, and slave labor remain widespread in the Thai fishing industry. In 2014, the U.S. Department of State's Trafficking in Persons report downgraded Thailand to Tier 3, the lowest possible ranking, as a result of the country's failure to address human trafficking, placing it alongside countries such as North Korea, Mauritania, and Iran.
เพราะว่าเขาพาคนไปเนี่ยพวกเรือลากนะคือมันใช้แรงงานโหดเกินมันหลอกไปจ้างไปตกไปเพราะว่าไม่สบายตายทิ้งทะเลมาเชิงสงขลาทีนี้ก็มันก็หลอกคนเข้าไปแล้วก็มันไปใช้แรงงานบางทีไป 2-3 ปีแล้วมันก็สับเปลี่ยนเรือมันไม่สิ้นหวังเลยอันนั้นน่ากลัว Sebenarnya semua Thailand mulai mulai dan sebenarnya kalau cerita kalau jauh dari major Thailand.
Overfishing and illegal pirate fishing have generated economic pressures which are fueling Thailand's slave trade. Depleted fish stocks mean that vessels are forced to stay at sea longer, go further afield, and deploy nets more often, all for diminishing returns.
So that gives us a brief insight into this issue today, and we also have some wonderful panelists who are joining us today. Jen Cole, Sandy Ellsworth are our two panelists with moderator Aurora Alifano. And so I just wanted to introduce you to them real quick. Jen Cole is the project manager at Fisheries, where she researches and develops initiatives to improve business practices and protect human and labor rights within the seafood industry. Jen attended Stanford University, where she earned both her Bachelor of Science and Master's of Science in Biology, with focuses on marine ecology and social ecological systems, respectively. Jen's academic experience in marine conservation and professional role working with foundations such as Fishwise have given her an interdisciplinary perspective to creating change in the field of conservation. So let's all join with welcoming Jen Cole.
Woohoo!
And next we have Sandy Ellsworth, who works for the National Resource Defense Council, where she advocates for policies that protect and restore our oceans. Prior to joining the National Resource Defense Council, she worked on climate change mitigation through the Montreal Protocol at the U.S. Department of State, and was a Knauss Marine Policy Fellow at NOAA's office in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
She holds a Master's in Environmental Management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a 500-ton ocean master's license. She might be able to explain that to us. And so give me and let's welcome Sandy now.
Thank you.
And lastly, we have our moderator, Aurora Elefano, who's the project director at Fishwise. And in this capacity, she leads multi-stakeholder initiatives to improve business practices that protect human and labor rights within the seafood industry. And so her cross-sector engagement strategies brings human rights, labor, and trafficking experts into the world of seafood sustainability. So this work integrates social responsibility into seafood sourcing recommendations, traceability improvements, and providing awareness and guidance to her other Fishwise partners. So let's give a warm welcome to Aurora Elefano as well. And now I'm going to turn this over to Aurora Elefano to start our panel.
Hi everyone, so nice to be here today. Thanks so much for coming. So I'm Aurora Alifano, Project Director here at Fishwise. And we work at the intersection of ocean conservation, seafood traceability, and human rights. So we work directly with retailers, suppliers, and distributors, as well as NGOs, to catalyze solutions to some of the toughest issues tackled in the seafood industry. So through that kind of collaboration and consultation, we're driving the industry towards more responsible practices, as you know is well needed. So as we just saw in the video, Thailand is one country that has been receiving a lot of investigative and media coverage on human rights and labor violations in seafood. However, I want to emphasize right up front that these issues are not limited to Thailand and have been documented in fisheries worldwide, including in developed countries like New Zealand and the UK. So you may know that social considerations weren't always at the forefront of the seafood industry or sector, so I'll orient you to some mechanisms that have helped the sustainable seafood movement create and sustain improvements over time. So 20 years ago, regulations that were designed to protect the ocean weren't working fast enough, and fisheries that fed millions of people and supported thousands of livelihoods were headed towards collapse. So recognizing a shared interest in accelerating change, the seafood industry and conservation leaders began to explore how they could work together. So as those relationships grew into a movement, they began to make progress by creating tools and incentives for businesses throughout supply chains to make sustainability practical and profitable, educating and encouraging consumers to increase demand for sustainable seafood, and advising and engaging policymakers so laws and regulations work for both industry and the environment. So now, as the movement is adapting to face new challenges, continued leadership means innovation in crafting conservation commitments, deepening those commitments, and addressing concerns and challenges like human rights and traceability. So that's where we'll focus tonight. So Sierra introduced our speakers. Thanks for doing that. It'd be great to get a feel for who else is in the room with us today. So I'm expecting a mix of NGO representatives and academics, scientists, and researchers. So I'd like for you to all applaud shamelessly and loudly when I call your affiliation. So let's hear a round of applause from folks in the room who are representing NGOs. Perfect. Great. Let's hear a round of applause for folks that are representing academic, research, and science. Great. Do we have anyone else in the room that isn't represented by those two affiliations? Industry, great. Can you say where you're from?
Project Data Systems, we do vessel tracking and energy traceability at sea.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Anyone else? Okay. Well, it's so great to have you all here. Thanks for coming. And with that, let's get started with the panel. Please give Jen Cole a warm welcome.
Yay. So as Sierra said, I'm Jen Cole. I work at Fishwise on our human rights team. So Aurora and I are both here representing Fishwise, and we're a nonprofit sustainable seafood consultancy that's based up in Santa Cruz. Because we're both here from Fishwise, I thought I'd orient you guys to us with a few slides. So we collaborate with industry, NGOs, and also researchers to help provide market-based tools for the seafood industry. So what that means is that a lot of our work focuses around partnering with seafood retailers, suppliers, and also doing research and providing information that helps support some of that work and helps support improvements in seafood sustainability. We do a lot of work on traceability as well, as Aurora mentioned, but Sandy, I think, will speak a lot to traceability later today. Our approach is through that collaborative approach, so building multi-stakeholder collaborations. We've done work with Larry Crowder with the Center for Ocean Solutions. A science paper that I'll mention later. And we also collaborate with industry-led efforts such as initiatives based in Thailand like the Seafood Task Force. We also further knowledge in the field through things like white papers and conferences. And then the private sector leadership that I've been talking about. So those of you who are from Santa Cruz or live in Santa Cruz now or visit, New Leaf was actually Fishwise's first partner about a decade ago. We started working with them to help be more transparent about the sustainability of seafood that they were offering. And in the past 15 years or so, Fishwise has actually expanded to do all of this work on traceability and human rights. And human rights is what I'll be speaking about today. So just to orient you to my talk, I'll start with the importance of seafood. So why this work in seafood that we're doing and why the sustainable seafood movement is so important. I'll also talk about what the issue is for human rights in seafood specifically and also globally. And then I'll discuss a little bit about what stakeholders can do. So just to dive in, there are actually 600 million people whose livelihoods are dependent on seafood, or fishing and aquaculture. That's about double the population of the US. So a huge number of people are dependent on seafood for their livelihoods. That's 12% of the world's population. And not only is seafood a really important source of livelihoods, it's also a really important nutrient source for people. So about a fifth of the global animal protein source consumed is seafood. So it's a huge animal protein source. The graphic that I'm showing up here today shows just how much seafood proteins are consumed. Essentially, the darker the country is, the more seafood they're consuming. You also see that some of the countries have lines on them, and that's to highlight that these countries consume over 20% of their animal proteins from seafood. So it's a really important resource. It's the most globally traded animal. In the US, we think about seafood a little bit less, but we're actually one of the top 3 seafood importers. And because we are such a big importer, we play a huge role in the global seafood trade, and thus it's really imperative that we know where our seafood is coming, what our supply chains look like, and what conditions are happening in our own supply chains. So this is something that the media has highlighted over the past few years. Starting in 2014, The Guardian produced an article called Revealed Asian Slave Labor Producing Prawns for Supermarkets in US and UK. So that's shrimp for us Americans. But that was actually the first time that a media source had connected these issues of human rights abuses in seafood to the North American seafood market specifically. And so various retailers in the US were called out. So that was really noteworthy because not only was it this issue is happening, but it was this issue is happening and we are buying it and we're a part of it, really. And that coverage continued with the New York Times had a series called The Outlaw Ocean, which investigated many of these issues in seafood. And then finally, some of the longest series of reporting on this issue is the Associated Press. So the Associated Press had a series of articles on seafood slavery. It actually won a Pulitzer for this reporting in 2015, 2016. And one of the reasons that this reporting won a Pulitzer was because actually over 300 forced laborers were rescued due to the reporting that was done and how it had highlighted these issues and where they were occurring. So to put a face to some of those laborers, you can see some of them actually up on this screen. In total, I think about 600 or 700 forced laborers ended up getting released after the media started to shine a light on this issue from remote islands near Thailand and Indonesia. And they were subjected to various conditions. So when modern day slavery happens, it often happens way before someone steps foot on a vessel or into a processing plant. It can happen when they're in their village and they're subjected to really deceptive recruiting practices. So they're promised a job abroad that will help make them money that they can then send home. And when they go to the country that they maybe don't have the correct papers for or are waiting for the correct papers for, their job is then switched. They may not get the money that they want, and they might be, their papers might be taken. So these things happen before people even enter the seafood industry or other industries that they're working in. Once they do begin to work, they can be subjected to 20-plus hour work days, the withholding of pay and documents, and many of these people are migrant workers, so they're especially vulnerable to this withholding of documents. And then many abuses, which were highlighted in these articles. And so that's sort of a case study in what can happen in some of the fishing industries in this region, but modern day slavery is actually a global issue. It spans various sectors, and it happens in all countries, including the United States. The estimates of modern day slaves are between 25 million and 40 million. It's really hard to get a number on these practices because they're intentionally hidden, as you might imagine. It's actually about 5 people to every 1,000. Many of them, as I highlighted, are migrant workers because they're some of the most vulnerable people across the globe. And these issues are exacerbated by the global food supply chains that we have and this availability of really low-cost labor. So as I said, it's widespread, and it happens even before people step foot in an industry to work in. And because it's so complex and such a big global issue, it really requires these coordinated collaborative efforts to begin to drive change. And it is very overwhelming to know where to start. So I'm going to tell you about it. I'm starting with what companies can do because that's one of Fishwise's primary areas of focus. I know that there's not a lot of industry in the room today, but companies have a history of sustainability initiatives. The seafood sustainability movement has been going on for about 20 years now. I think we just had the 20th anniversary. One of the terrible things about human rights abuses, but encouraging things for getting the industry to act, is that unlike environmental sustainability, there isn't really this sliding scale of acceptability for what you can do to mitigate or prevent human rights abuses in your supply chains. You can say, oh, environmental sustainability might not be one of my priorities. I think I'll focus less on that. You can't do that for human rights. So there isn't that sliding scale. Companies really need to act because there's also a huge reputational risk. You saw the media articles that I posted. That was just a very, very small number of what's been done over the past few years to highlight this issue to consumers. Consumers don't want the seafood that they're buying to be associated with forced labor. So obviously that gives companies an incentive to act. Unlike some of the environmental movement, there's actually really good places to start. There's a lot of work that's been done in the human rights space to help companies address this issue in other industries. So just to start, the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights actually say that companies have the duty to respect human rights. And then when companies begin to do this work, they can look at their supply chains, assess their risks, set expectations, and then really communicate or ensure that workers have open communication chains for them to verify that these conditions are what they should be. So that's what companies can do. Not everyone has the power to act within a company, but all of us are consumers. So as a consumer, you really have the power to know what's going on in your supply chain. So ask, how sustainable is this? Do you know what practices this is associated with? Do you know where this is caught, where this is processed? Just knowing those few details gives you a better sense of what the risks might be. And then as a consumer, you are buying from these companies, so you also have the opportunity to tell them what you would like them to be focusing on in their own supply chains. I think one great example for this, although it is not in the seafood industry, is a few years ago, it was found that there was prison labor being used for some of Whole Foods products. That is something that the consumer obviously does not want to see. Consumers made a stand and said, Whole Foods, this is not what we want. Obviously, Whole Foods is a bit of a niche example, but I think within a few months they had proceeded to stop using prison labor for that product. So consumers do really have that power to drive change. And then finally, I know that this is a very heavily academic crowd, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what researchers can do. The recommendations here are from the Committing to Socially Responsible Seafood paper that was published last year. If you have any further questions about that, you can ask myself, Aurora, or Larry. Aurora and Larry are actually authors on this paper, and that photo is from a meeting following the publication that we had last year in Monterey. So some of the recommendations in that paper are, it's really important to link these social issues to what's going on the environmental side. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals actually do link well-being and environmental sustainability, but there needs to be a lot more integration for fisheries and aquaculture, and that needs to happen through research and monitoring. So the sustainable seafood movement has had a lot of research associated with it. As you've seen for human rights and seafood, I highlighted a lot of media stories. There were fewer research publications for me to highlight, and I think that's an area where we need a more evaluative approach and that there's a lot of work that can be done. And then continuing to be responsive to these real world needs. You know, researchers are not always the ones implementing. So if you are producing a research paper or advising what should be done, it's really important to include key stakeholders in that effort and those recommendations to ensure that when you make a recommendation, it can actually start to be implemented. That is where the real stuff happens. So the takeaways from today: seafood is a really important resource. Human rights and seafood are very heavily linked, and so protecting human rights and seafood should be a priority, especially given what an important resource it is. And all stakeholders have a role to contribute. So with that, I will pass it over to Sandy.
Thank you, Jen. I didn't make a PowerPoint, so we're just gonna keep this great one up. So thanks for providing that for me. I also wanted to thank all of you for, thanks, Jen. What a colleague. Yes, so I am Sandy Ellsworth. I'm an oceans advocate with the Natural Resources Defense Council. That is a large environmental NGO. I'm based in San Francisco, but we also have offices in many cities in the United States and one in India and Beijing. But I interrupted myself in the middle of thanking you. I wanted, to return to that. Thanks, Aurora. Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Kristen. And Kathy. Is that right? Yeah. Sorry, Sierra. For the kind introduction and for having me, and to all of you for the important work that you're doing, particularly in a time when there is a very obvious and pronounced assault on the value of science in making our world a better place and saving some of our most precious natural resources that we all depend on. So thank you for that. And I also just wanted to let you know that I transitioned to my marine policy career coming from working on educational vessels and also oceanographic vessels as a mate and captain. So I am well versed in the challenges and thrill of conducting scientific research at sea. So just know that I appreciate the work that so many of you are doing. To complement the talk that Jen just gave, I'm going to talk about three things today, and I am focused more on this issue from an environmental perspective, but a key takeaway is that these two issues really need to be married, and there are very complementary ways that they can be, and ways that they can share many of the same solutions that they referring to seafood slavery and also fishery sustainability. So I will first just talk about the importance of sustainable fisheries and how depleted fisheries have been a real driver of human rights violations in the seafood industry. And this is why. So overfishing poses one of the greatest threats to ocean ecosystem health and undermines food security and also national security throughout the globe. As context for that, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that commercial fishery stocks have been depleted precipitously even over the last 4 decades or so. And the percentage of fish stocks that are considered to be fully fished or overfished is up to around 70%. So fish are a renewable resource that can be managed sustainably. But unfortunately, that is much harder to achieve than we would like it to be. But it's possible to manage fisheries sustainably. A really important piece of that national security in fishery sustainability is the fact that fisheries are a huge employer. So Jen pointed to the tremendous number of fishermen that there are in the world. And that's a key piece of upholding the social fabric of many communities. Of artisanal small-scale fisheries, that employment in those constitutes about 90% of the world's fishermen. So you just imagine that's a lot of jobs. And the way this connects to fishery sustainability is that when local near-coastal fisheries become depleted, that constitutes a real employment risk for many fishermen and can force them into different professions. So some of you might remember during the outbreak of the Somali pirates, some of those pirates had been fishermen that were out of work and needed to seek other ways to generate revenue to support their families and communities. So that is a really dramatic example, but the take home is that many, many people in the world depend on healthy fisheries for their livelihoods. And when that falls apart, that can undermine an entire society. So and to sort of close the loop on the sustainable fisheries piece and how that can lead to a real demand for cheap or slave labor. You can imagine a fishery becoming depleted, and what that forces is boats to go further and further offshore, which means that costs become higher. You need to have more food on board a vessel, you need to have more gas, and the only sort of flexible cost in there can be labor. So there can be a really strong sort of demand or lever on reducing labor costs. And so that can incentivize seafood slavery. So that is a way that this sort of becomes a vicious cycle that perpetuates. So as more and more boats go further out to sea and spend longer and longer out away from home, that fosters more and more overfishing. And so it continues. An important piece of this fisheries sustainability is something called IUU fishing, which is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And that's a type of, this is a very generalized statement right now, so I will give you that caveat now. But IUU fishing is fishing that happens outside of the bounds of regulation and legality, and it leads to habitat destruction and more overfishing, right? So if you are fishing within a marine protected area, that was an area where there was supposed to be the intention is to protect that habitat and also to not remove fish from that area. So that is a way of exacerbating overfishing. And many times when you have IUU fishing, you will have actors that are already disregarding the law, so that would make them more likely to employ slave labor or workers that are having human rights violated on board their vessels. And so IUU fishing is strongly linked to violations of human rights on board fishing vessels. And I wanted to just take a moment also, I just pointed out the link between IUU fishing and sort of the fact that captains or companies that are engaged in IUU fishing are less likely to observe other laws such as human rights laws or labor laws. And the same is true for other types of crime. So if you have a lot of times IUU fishing will be linked to other sorts of transnational crimes like drug running or arms running. And there's a way, in thinking about solutions to this, there are many overlaps and opportunities to share solutions. So for example, there are entire UN programs that focus on arms trafficking, but many times those arms are trafficked on vessels that might pose as fishing vessels, which then have workers that are fishermen but being paid or not paid at all to be on board those vessels. So these are all linked, and it's in recognizing the link to many types of crimes, not just illegal fishing. There are opportunities to crack down on the problem of seafood slavery or other human rights violations that take place on board vessels. And sort of tying that up into a optimistic bow, I would say that this is a pretty heavy topic, but if you look at many of the problems with depleted fisheries and then also seafood slavery, because many of them have shared drivers, they can share some of the same solutions. So moving into more of the solution space, I'm going to talk about the role of the United States as one of the world's largest seafood markets. We sort of fluctuate between number 2 and number 3. I don't know, Jen may know, but in my talking points, I say that the US is the top 2 market for seafood. And the point of that, regardless of that ranking, is that the United States has enormous market power to drive change in both sustainable fisheries and then also tamping down on human rights violations in the seafood sector. So, taking a step back and focusing on the U.S., on the role of the U.S.'s market, I would first just note that the U.S. imports about 90% of its seafood. About 50% of that is wild caught. So, again, that's a really important opportunity. And one piece, bringing in the political lens and referring back to a comment that Jen made in her presentation, is that there is no tolerance for slavery in supply chains. It's not something that any politician would be tolerant of. So when I first began working on this issue, it was right around the change of the administration, and we were evaluating potential opportunities with the new administration. And in beginning to look at congressional engagement on this issue and then also administrative engagement on this issue, we did see opportunity, because this is something, if you look at the congressional side of things, that has had both Republican and Democratic support for working on. And so that's something that poses a real opportunity. I'll make that point later on. So there is political interest in working on this issue, which is another reason that focusing solely on the environmental piece of this, while it's important to understand that it's a driver, there is, I think, more traction to be gained in emphasizing the human rights violations that are common in the seafood industry. That brings me to seafood traceability, which hopefully doesn't seem like too much of an unwieldy concept. Something that is really tricky about being at sea is that many of your actions on a vessel are concealed and occur far away from land. And you can imagine a fishing vessel, the process of trying to bring fish from a fishing vessel all the way to market, to a restaurant where it ends up on your plate. And it can change hands many, many, many times. And because that initial harvest occurs so far out to sea and away from many eyes that might supervise or enforce the type of fishing that's taking place on that vessel, it becomes really hard to trace out exactly where that fish traveled and who harvested it and what sort of labor practices were employed on that fishing vessel. And so that is where traceability, so knowing kind of point to point where that fish came from and whose hands it touched, becomes essential to solving this problem. It's important to note that traceability is a key tool. It's not necessarily a solution, but it is fundamental to any effort to solve the problems both of fisheries sustainability and also human rights violations in the seafood industry. So bringing this all back to the US as a really powerful driver, as in playing a huge role as one of the world's top consumers of seafood, I wanted to talk about something called the Seafood Import Monitoring Program that NOAA promulgated a rule for, and it has now begun enforcing it. So I will explain what that is and then talk about how that might help. The Seafood Import Monitoring Program identifies 13 at-risk species, and those are species that are most at risk of IUU fishing, and it requires full supply chain traceability for those 13 species. An important nuance is that 2 of those are not currently, while they're included in the rule, they're not currently, they're stayed for now. And importantly, one of those 2 species is shrimp, which is one of the products that is most at risk of human rights violations. So having shrimp be included will be really important in the future. So in requiring full supply chain traceability, what that allows is for U.S. officials to identify a shipment that might be suspicious or that might be suspect or seems a little fishy, and it will have, and there's an automatic system and then also manual analysts that will look at the information that's been required before that product is imported into the US, and they'll say, this doesn't add up. And so they'll put, the system will flag that shipment, and then ideally it would be intercepted at the border, and then there would be a trace back to every part of the supply chain, and then that information could be used to ideally drive changes from that importer and in the fisheries practices that allow that product to be almost imported into the United States. So that's the Seafood Import Monitoring Program. And I raise that because that's an example of how the US is working on traceability. The goal of that program is, NOAA is seeing that as a way to prevent IUU fishing, fish product from being imported into the US and then demonstrate like, hey, the US is not going to be tolerant of this sort of product. So I think a natural fit and opportunity for the Seafood Import Monitoring Program would be to also require information about labor practices that went into harvesting that seafood. That is something that many people commented on as that rule was being developed, and NOAA has said that it is open to complying with an investigation related to human rights violations in the seafood industry, but that since it's not their jurisdiction, they won't require any of those data elements. And I raise that right now just to illustrate one of the obstacles among US government agencies in being able to leverage different laws that they have in different jurisdictions that they have to attack this problem from a multi-agency perspective. So there are some really important laws on the books. Jen will mention a couple of those later. There are laws on the books that could certainly be used to help, to really help prevent seafood that was harvested in this manner from entering the U.S. As of right now, they're being enforced in a very compartmentalized and narrow manner, but that is something that many entities have recognized as an opportunity, and that's also where the political piece of this, human rights violations among food that we eat is intolerable, and there is bipartisan support for addressing it. And then finally, the last point that I wanted to make is that a sort of thing we can all be doing right now is Jen already talked about all of our roles as consumers, and then another really important role, I think, for different businesses and NGOs and potentially academics, different sectors, something we can do is be nimble and actually talk more overtly about the link to social issues in our work. So, for example, at NRDC, as I work on oceans issues, even though a key piece of my portfolio is fisheries sustainability, when I talk about fisheries policy, I can also talk about its link to human rights violations. So that's a tangible step that I think many of us can take. So with that, I will turn it back over to Aurora. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Sandy. I'd like to ask our panelists to join me on stage. So thanks so much, Jen, for that presentation. We learned about the background behind the issue and next steps for what companies, consumers, and researchers can do. And thank you, Sandy, for those core concepts of IUU Fishing and traceability and the seafood import monitoring program. So lots of content to cover. I'd like to kick off the discussion with our panelists with a few questions, and then I'd like to turn it over to you, the audience. I'm sure there's a few questions out there or some comments to how this relates to your work as well. So the first thing I want to ask our panelists is a pressing question that we get quite a bit when folks learn about this issue, and there's this question of, should we be boycotting certain companies, certain geographies, certain products? Wouldn't that just solve the problem if we didn't source from those places? And I'll turn it over. This is for both of you to respond to.
I can start a little bit talking about the issue because Thailand's received a lot of focus, and then if you want to expand. So when a lot of those media articles that I pulled up on the screen came out, people started to wonder, should we be boycotting seafood, specifically shrimp, from Thailand? Boycotts can be effective. It has to be in the right environment. So one of the things that we've talked about today is that the U.S. is like the second or third importer of seafood. I think we're number 2, right? Number 1 is Japan, and number 3 is China. So for a boycott of certain species, specifically shrimp from Thailand, to be effective, it would require, I think, more parties than maybe a small subsection of the U.S. requesting that a boycott happen or not buying these products. One of the things that can be more effective, especially from the company side, is if you ask for certain policies to be put in place for suppliers sourcing from Thailand or suppliers in Thailand, processing facilities in Thailand, that can actually put in place these policies and practices that they're then using for, majority of their seafood and a majority of what they're exporting. So it does a little bit more given the particular environment that I think we mostly hear about, which is, should I be boycotting seafood from Southeast Asia? And it's really hard. We aren't the biggest importer, and there are other markets for, Thailand and others to go to should we boycott.
Sure. And I would just add to that that it's a really tricky problem and difficult question to answer for the reasons that Jen mentioned. And another really important one is simply that sort of casting light on these issues can actually be more helpful because sort of, stigmatizing a certain nation or company can sometimes drive that activity underground rather than saying, okay, this is a situation and it's something we want to rectify. So I think there are some concrete examples of that where companies have been, they've had kind of the PR turned on them and then said, acknowledge that it's a problem and taken steps to correct it. But there is such a strong demand for cheap seafood that I think kind of having the tempting reaction to boycott that product will perpetuate that industry. I do think, like Jen said earlier, that, well, I guess Jen and I have both said this, but exercising your power as a consumer to ask for transparency in supply chains and to care about that and to choose sustainable seafood certainly makes a difference. So in saying, don't boycott, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should eat everything and welcome every type of seafood. But there are opportunities to, use your power as a consumer.
And I think if we're thinking at a government level, and this isn't human rights, so Sandy, you might have to fill in a little bit more, but the EU carding system, right, is really effective for market access and improving practices that might, prevent illegal fishing. So if you want to speak more about that too.
Let's see. Well, so one thing that the EU has done that there are many people in the U.S. that think that it would be great if the U.S. could replicate. I think the NGOs fall in different camps on this issue, but the EU has a system where they will basically assign a color to a nation that takes a look at or reflects how that nation is doing in terms of supply chain traceability, and then also they have a human rights element of that, and they will then work with that nation. So let's say they give a nation a red card and it says, we're not going to buy your product from until you rectify this. They will work very closely with that nation to kind of bring them up to par. So there's sort of this carrot and stick approach to it. And the U.S. also engages with consultations with nations on illegal fishing, but does not have that human rights element of it, which I think is a really important opportunity that we're not taking advantage of right now.
Yeah, and the U.S. does have the Trafficking in Persons report, which comes out annually, and so it assesses countries' government response to the likelihood of trafficking in their country. There are actually sanctions associated with being a country that's tier 3, so like the worst ranking, but oftentimes those sanctions get waived, and so its effectiveness can be slightly limited in that way, but it does raise awareness.
And then I would love to hear from both of you on this, but I know that similar to the Seafood Watch Guide that Monterey Bay Aquarium has, there are now NGOs that are developing a human rights sort of guide for seafood, and some of those tools just came out, but I don't know much more about it than that.
Yeah, so the Monterey Bay Aquarium just came out with a seafood slavery risk tool. It's a high-level risk tool that looks at the potential likelihood that there could be trafficking or human rights abuses in your seafood. It's encouraging that this issue is being brought to the attention of more people, especially consumers. It is a high-level risk tool, right? So it doesn't take into account the practices in place that might mitigate these abuses, right? If you're sourcing from a high-risk area, but you have a lot of robust policies and practices in place, good traceability system, good verification on what's happening, then that at times, to me, can sometimes be better than sourcing from a lower medium risk area and not having those policies and practices. So you have to understand the limitations of any tool you use, but it's so encouraging that this issue has been brought to more people's attention in recent years.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for making that link to the fact that this is a global issue, pointing out what's happening in the EU, and then a little bit about what's happening here at home with some of the NGOs. In addition to that, is there anything the state of California can do to tackle forced labor in seafood?
Yes. Let's see. What can California do? So this is, let's see, when I first started looking into this, I was very excited because California is kind of an incubator of many, many things, technology, really progressive policies. And I was excited to discover the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, which you guys may need to help me with some of the details of it, but it basically says that companies that do business in California and have revenues of over $100 million need to post some sort of public disclosure of what actions they're taking to ensure that there's not slavery in their supply chains. And that was something that Senator Kamala Harris, when she was Attorney General, I guess was instrumental in the creation of and implementation of. And since then, I have heard some and read some kind of scathing reviews of the extent to which that's not being utilized as well as it could be. I would say, though, that where that is the case, that's also an opportunity. And the state, so that's sort of thing one, is that even though that law exists and many say that, you know, it has no teeth and is not really being implemented as powerfully as it could be, given the growing interest in this issue, that is something that could be sort of advanced and would certainly apply to certain seafood suppliers in California. And then another opportunity that I see in California is that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has become increasingly interested in kind of enforcement issues and wildlife trafficking issues. And so I think that that is something, given their interest and the fact that there are now actually pretty good state resources that are being invested in wildlife trade issues and marine protected area enforcement and sort of, yeah, these other sides of kind of fisheries management and trade. I think there are opportunities for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to work more closely with NOAA and Customs and Border Protection. So that is not much that's super concrete, but I do think that I know that the state has a really important role to play. And then another key piece of that, just recalling kind of the role of the U.S. as a huge market, is that California is a tremendous market. We're the world's 6th largest economy, and something like 30% of the seafood imported into the United States comes through the ports of LA and Long Beach. So that is an important opportunity.
Yeah, and just to speak a little bit more about what governments can do, state or national, it's really interesting. You'll see that there are sort of two ways that governments have been moving. Oftentimes they'll work in conjunction with each other. But the first is what California did, I think, in 2010, when the Transparency in Supply Chains Act came out. Or it might have been earlier than that, I think in 2003. It was 2020? Okay. So it's like a disclosure act. So it's requiring that companies disclose what they're doing to prevent human rights abuses from happening in their supply chains. And the other side of that is these more enforcement-heavy acts. And so an example of that, enforcement is tricky, right? Because how well is it being implemented? But the other side of that is the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. And that actually came into play in 2016. And what it said was before then, or between like 1930 and 2016, in the US, you could actually import, if you're an importer, you could import a good that was made wholly or in part by forced labor if the U.S. supply of that good didn't meet U.S. demand of that good. So that law, I think, was created in 1930 or between world wars. You're thinking about resource access to all of these resources when it might have made sense. However, 70 years later, that act makes less sense, and that act's provision of whether the supply met the demand wasn't really being enforced anyway. I think maybe 13 products got blocked in that 70-year period. So in 2016, Obama signed something that said, hey, we're closing that loophole. You can't import goods made by forced labor anymore. And now Customs and Border Protection is tasked with deciding how to implement that and determining how you can implement that. And it's really hard to do so if you don't have traceability, which Sandy was talking about. So I think there are really encouraging things to be seen there. No seafood product has been blocked yet. A few products have been blocked. It's mostly been Chinese prison labor products, but nothing from seafood has been blocked. So I think once some of these products with less traceability start to get blocked, we'll start to see how the precedent is going to get set with that law, but it hasn't been established yet.
And a really important part of that law, as I understand it, is that in order for an enforcement action to begin, there needs to be a petition saying, this product was imported with slave labor, and so that is something that many different organizations could work on. The burden of proof is pretty heavy. We have some colleagues at ILRF, I can never remember what it stands for, but
International Labor Rights Law.
Thank you. That had a number of conversations with Customs and Border Protection about sort of like what would it take to bring about a case relating to, say, shrimp, and basically would need to be able to trace it down to like an individual shrimp, right? Yeah, or shipment level. There we go. That's not as bad as an individual shrimp, but just about as bad. But because anyone can bring a petition, and because there's an increased demand for transparency and increased awareness of this issue, that is something that I think could happen in the foreseeable future and is an important opportunity.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the ways that this administration has carried forward some of those provisions is by, there's a law that I think an executive order that Trump signed late last year that was countering America's adversaries through sanctions. There are quite a lot of provisions against North Korea in that, as you might imagine. The Associated Press came out with an article this past fall talking about how there have been North Korean laborers in Chinese seafood processing facilities. So that's a lever too. You need to know who's working in your processing facilities, because now, given this Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, the U.S. can't import goods made by North Korean laborers, regardless of whether they're in North Korea or not. So it's not just you can't import North Korean goods, it's you can't import goods made by North Korean laborers. So that might be processing facilities in China, that might be, I know that there are quite a lot of North Korean workers in Russia. It spans various countries, but that's another reason we need traceability, and we also need traceability that includes some social elements, like where are your workers from?
So pulling it all together, the new legislation, very important and exciting. Enforcement of that legislation, also very important. Can we talk a little bit about the technology and science that might help to address these issues as well?
Sandy, I'm going to ask you to start on that one.
Oh man, there are, and we have an audience member that might be able to talk about some of the technology. Okay, I will go back to my time at sea when there was a certain point in my career where all of a sudden our vessels were required to have an AIS, so automatic information or identification system. I can't remember which one, but it's sort of a GPS that sends out a signal conveying information about the ship that you're on. And right now, AIS is a really powerful tool. It's unbelievable how much information is out there. You can see where vessels are moving, what kind of vessels they are, how many people they have on board. So that's a really useful tool. A limitation of AIS is that right now it's only required of fairly large vessels. I think something like 200 tons or over. Is that right? Of the 200, right? Anyway, large vessels. And so is not being used down at, a small fishing vessel level, which is what's needed. There's also something called VMS, which is a vessel monitoring system. And that's a different system that gives you tracking information about where a vessel is going. And something key about these sort of ship-based tracking systems is that you can learn a lot about a vessel from them. So through sort of spying on them, you can tell what kind of fishing they're doing because, different types of fishing require different types of vessel movements. And you can also see what ships are kind of frequently going to another ship and, say, offloading fish, that's an activity called transshipment that happens at sea, where there's a transfer of cargo, and that is a very effective tool, unfortunately, in kind of concealing who's harvesting fish, and it's a way to really hide IUU fish. So you can look. So those systems where you can kind of spy on vessels are key. So I guess that's a really critical part of that. That transparency in terms of vessel movements has provided a really incredible wealth of information. Something that I hear again and again at different kind of big data forums is that there still is a need for kind of a repository of all this information. Like as of right now, there's no global list of all IUU fishing vessels, and I think there are various ones that are being worked on, but there's not sort of one centralized location that's searchable and where you can search data and figure out like, aha, this vessel is a huge problem. Which seems simple, except that the world is enormous and there are so many fishing vessels out there that that's really hard to actually pull off. And then, you guys, I'll stop talking in a minute. There's just so much to talk about.
Keep going.
But it's something really, I think, kind of fascinating and also something that gives me hope is blockchain technology. And I don't think that it is a panacea for all cargo shipments that will come into the United States, but it does allow for very specific, keeping track of really specific transactions along a supply chain. And there are companies like Maersk, I believe, that are piloting blockchain technology in tracking individual shipments. So I think that that's a really important tool. And then kind of jumping many, many steps in the supply chain in thinking about NOAA's implementation of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program. There is a sophisticated database that seafood importers of record will be filling out, and the goal of that system is for it to become automated and sort of be able to flag individual shipments as they come into the U.S. I think right now NOAA is relying too heavily on manual, meaning like human beings sitting at computers analyzing that data. And I think that sort of threatens the potential effectiveness of the program, but I do think that there is technology out there where the system could become smarter and smarter at detecting suspicious shipments. So those are just some examples. Yeah.
Do we have time for me to mention one thing as well?
Yes.
One thing that I don't want to forget when we're talking about technology is the worker voice side of things. I don't know a lot about this piece of technology yet. I will next month after a meeting that I'm going to. But some large seafood suppliers have started to put in place the technology that I think their branding is like Fleet One. But essentially it allows workers who are on vessels to communicate with their family and friends and loved ones back home when they're in international waters or places where they wouldn't usually have internet access. So that's a really important piece of technology that allows workers to have a voice and report out on what's happening to them. So I didn't want to neglect mentioning that.
Thank you, Jen. So now that our panelists have given us all this great content to muse over, I'd really like to turn it over to you, the audience, for an interactive discussion. So if you have a question or a comment perspective you'd like to raise for our panelists, please do raise your hand and I'll call on you. We have a mic to run as well.
Do you want to use the mic? Sure. It feels so formal. First of all, thank you for your talks and presentations. That was a lot of information on a variety of scales. And one comment is that just the comment I think that Sandy made about as small scale fisheries or near shore fisheries get depleted, people going offshore, that sort of squeezing that balloon and that balloon being squeezed in the human aspect was really not one I had thought about. And you both spent a lot of time talking about international fisheries, but that aspect of near scale fisheries being depleted happens here in the States. So I'm wondering if can you speak to examples of human rights abuses in the States? Are there maybe more subtle ways that manifest? Because I personally would be interested in hearing about that.
I can start and then others can fill in. I think especially when you're talking about fishing, it's really hard to talk about human rights abuses because being a fisherman on a fishing vessel sort of just looks like a human rights abuse in and of itself. You're stuck on a boat, you can't leave, you're working really long hours. Sometimes your documents get put in a space to be kept dry. So when you talk about the fishing industry, it's really challenging to think about how to do it well in a way where fishers can make money and not work these long hours and do all of these crazy things. But some of the biggest issues that we've seen for human rights abuses in the States, there was a story, I think, a year and a half ago, where there were workers on Hawaiian fishing vessels that were migrant workers, didn't have the necessary papers, weren't actually like protected under the same laws that a US citizen would be protected on those fishing vessels. And there was a restriction of movement, which is an indicator of forced labor. So they would go out to fish, they would come back into port. If you were a US citizen, you could go wherever you wanted in Honolulu. If you weren't, you would be sort of restricted to still the vessel or just the port area itself. So that's one example. I do think it's I love your question because it's a really great opportunity to highlight the fact that these human rights abuses have been better documented in certain areas, but they've also been seen, say, on UK fishing vessels. So this really is a global issue.
Yeah, and one I was going to bring up, just to add to what Jen said, something that was really stunning and also depressing about that Hawaii longline case was that there was a senior staffer on the House Natural Resources Committee that learned about this and was totally appalled and was like, well, this is simple. Like, I'm a lawyer. All we have to do is close this visa loophole that allows for the Hawaiian fishing industry to employ these laborers, but not let them set foot ashore. And then he did some digging, NRDC dug into it a little bit, and they wrote a formal letter to NOAA and Department of Homeland Security, and it caused a real, okay, I'll get to that part later, but basically there wasn't an easy fix from a legal perspective. And then on the political front, I know that one of the points I've made this talk is that there is this, really strong sort of universal abhorrence of human rights violations. Yet in spite of that, the Hawaii delegation in Congress, who they are real sort of champions of a lot of marine protection and kind of real allies, they found it to be very, I guess the fishing industry there has so much political power that they were totally closed to kind of doing anything about it. And so now Hawaii at the state level is working on that issue, but at the federal level, there was kind of this uproar and great concern, and I would say that still exists, but in terms of getting to legislative solutions or administrative solutions, at least on that particular issue, I think things are sort of stalled right now. Yeah.
Can I add one thing? This is a slight deviation from your original question, but one of the things I got from it was, what are the issues that we're seeing for U.S. caught seafood? And I think one of the things that we might not always think about for U.S. caught seafood is most of the time it's processed abroad, and processing is a risk area for human rights abuses. So you could have a fish that's caught in the U.S. with no human rights abuses, but it might still be processed under conditions of forced labor. And it's still being, sold as a U.S. fish.
And another, picking up on your comment, you use the term nearshore community, and I think that's a really important segue to this as well, because we're talking a lot about egregious human rights and labor violations. Just because those aren't apparent in a fishery doesn't mean it's technically socially responsible. We're looking at other things about community livelihoods, equity, food security. So there's a whole big issue wrapped up in what is social responsibility, what does that mean in fisheries, that we've just scratched the surface on here today. So that could probably be a whole other lecture series for you to consider in the future.
You guys are available next week.
Oh, exactly. Any other comments from the audience? Thoughts? Yes, please. Yes.
Hi, great. So I was wondering, so I know on the West Coast for commercial fisheries, we have like, in order to like make sure that the seafood is like traceable and that there's no like unnecessary waste, we have like 100% observer coverage for the commercial vessels. So for like the importers that are like suspect, like how can you like, I guess, guarantee that like, that if you're working with them, if you've partnered with them and they say that they're doing everything legally, how do you like how can you like verify that, like through like reports, or how are they like giving that information to you? And like, are, you know, sort of like loopholes, and I feel like there's always like little things that can go amiss.
I can talk a little bit about verification of worker conditions. That's really challenging to do. I think historically, historically the industry's relied heavily on audits, but audits of course give you a snapshot of what's going on at one point in time. For the human rights and social responsibility space, a way that the industry is moving is towards worker voice mechanisms. And so that's sort of what I alluded to with the Fleet One tool. So how can workers actually report out on their conditions in a way where they're not penalized for what they're reporting on? And then there's a system in place to sort of close the loop after that grievance has been noted and ensure that there's some sort of remedy. On the environmental side for, verifying that something isn't caught illegally. I don't know, Sandy.
It's similar. So the industry really relies on audits. And in preparing for this panel, I can't even remember exactly what the source was, but there was a really powerful quote that I read that I unfortunately can't attribute to the rightful source, but they said, this isn't a problem that we can audit our way out of, just because there are so many transactions and so many vessels. They are a really important tool. And I would say the same is true for IUU seafood. There needs to be kind of a faster way, faster and more comprehensive way, rather than sort of even targeted or super well-informed audits to tamp out the problem. So I think, some combination of audits, they're still an important tool, and then technology and the worker's voice piece is super important.
And because you mentioned observers, I also want to just say something really quickly on observer safety and observer verification. It can actually be really dangerous for observers to verify information that comes with a price premium, so that it's like fad-free and other things. So actually observers themselves have asked not to have to verify those things that come with a price premium. Scientific data, great. Things that come with a price premium, that leads them to potentially be subjected to coercion, violence. There have been a few cases of observers going missing. So when we're thinking about this verification piece, we have to also think about the safety of who's verifying and what they're verifying.
Let's take one here, and then one more, and then I think that'll be our time.
Sure. So there's been some great talks that you guys have been giving, so thank you so much. So kind of what I got out of a lot of this is that these issues have only really recently been brought to public attention, and we've only recently seen, some positive things that have yielded positive results in the news. And I was just wondering, kind of where we are in this issue of human rights and fisheries. Like, do we think that this is something that's become more of a concern recently, or are we just becoming more aware of it recently? and kind of like maybe there just isn't enough information to answer this question, but kind of what the historic timescale of this is. Like, do we think that this is becoming more serious because of certain issues in fisheries, or do we think that this is on a downward tilt because of regulations we're putting into effect? How do we think, what's the trajectory here, I guess, is my question.
What a great question. Who wants to take a stab first?
I can take a stab first, and then I can, I guess, speak to it more broadly. But again, it is a really good question, so I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is correct. But I would say that there's probably, if I were to sort of intuit, looking at like human history, I would imagine that this has been a really pervasive problem for a really long time that has only recently sort of come into light and into consciousness. Although I would also say that given the fact that overfishing is such a driver of human rights abuses in the seafood industry, I would expect that, you know, as fisheries have declined kind of near shore, that it has likely increased. So I would say it's been a problem for a long time and is also maybe worse in places where there are overfished fish stocks.
Yeah, and I guess my take on that is, right, human rights abuses are not a new problem at all. They've been happening throughout history. One of the things I think that has been unique over the past 20, 30, 40 years is the globalization of the food supply chain. I think in addition to the pressures that you were talking about, Sandy, that really adds a really murky element to knowing where your food has come from and how it's been produced. So I think that has really contributed to these issues occurring recently, but there has been a lot of media attention to it. I mentioned the environmental movement in my slide. One of the things about raising awareness for human rights is that it is an area where people are less likely to say that they're okay with the abuse persisting. That doesn't necessarily mean it always translates into action or that the actions that it's translating into are the most effective ones. But I do think that, at least comparing this to the environmental movement, changes have been happening faster than I think people saw 20 years ago at the start. So that to me is encouraging, at least.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just wanted to change the slide because we also have some great resources for you to follow up on. So the first one is the white paper that Fishwise has produced. It's available online. It gets updated every 6 months or so. So if you're looking for more background on these issues, what can companies be doing, and who's working in this space, whether that's NGOs, consultancies, government offices, a lot of that is contained in the white paper along with contacts for those folks. So great resource to go to if you want to learn more. In addition, the Seafood Slavery Risk Tool we mentioned briefly from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, and Liberty Asia was just recently released. You may have seen it in the news. And then some resources from the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions. So just to segue, following up on your question, we have time for one more question, and then we'll have to close. Do we have a mic that can reach that far?
I can also yell. So I'm curious, following up on the question about verification.
Sandy, you had mentioned blockchain as one of the things that you see as an exciting sort of tool. And I'm curious if you guys have seen good examples of where blockchain is well-grounded in the physical product that's moving through. Because one of the challenges that we sort of see is that as software gets better and better at documenting and sort of putting a lock on all of these different transactions that happens, that also potentially creates better cover for fraudulent transactions if it's not well-grounded in the physical product that's moving through that supply chain. So I'm curious where some good examples might be of how that software innovation is getting linked actually to the physical transfer of seafood as well.
I feel really sad because one example that I have is, but it doesn't mean it's the only example out there. I know that when Maersk was kind of piloting the blockchain technology in some of its shipments, They were looking at shipments of pineapples, and so they found that it was effective. But yeah, there are definitely limitations to it, and I'm optimistic about the technology for sure, but I don't think, like many sort of technology solutions, it's not necessarily like a panacea in and of itself. And I know it's also super energy intensive, and so I'm not, sure how it could be exactly what deployment would look like at a really large scale. But pineapples, that's what I got. And I don't know if anyone else in the audience knows about other examples.
No, when I think of blockchain's use in food supply chains, most of the examples that I can think of are pilots at this point. And
Can you guys explain what blockchain is? I think a lot of us might not know what that even is.
So I can start, but anyone in the audience who feels more comfortable explaining should feel welcome too. It's a way to track information in various places. It's most famous for being what Bitcoin is based off of. It's a way to track information.
You can think of it as like a digital lock, right? So every time a transaction happens, there's some sort of digital seal basically that gets applied to each transaction, so you can't go back and sort of re-edit and audit and change the history of transactions. But particularly when you're thinking about how to apply that in seafood, and you have a whole fish that gets then divided up into fillets, and then lots of white fillets look the same. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges of going from sort of a Bitcoin scenario to the seafood world is that how do you link that digital security basically strip that's going with each transaction saying yes, everything is verified, to the physical product, that's sitting there in front of you. And so it's very, I know it's largely in the pilot stage, and that is up on where successes might be on how people are trying to solve that.
It's a great question. There's so much happening in that space right now, and if you just create a Google alert for blockchain, your inbox will be full. So there's a lot of really exciting developments in this space. It's something we plan to be able to speak to over time, especially understanding what is that link to the social piece as well. So hopefully more to come soon on that. And we're nearing the end of our session, so thank you so much for attending. I'd really like to thank Jen and Sandy for sharing their expertise with us today, and really thank the Marine team for inviting us to be here. I think I speak for all of us when I say we're really grateful for the opportunity to give this issue a voice and to speak with you today. So any questions, please feel free to contact any of us. Visit the resources on the page, and we'll be around for the next half hour or so to answer any more questions.